Welcome back. President Biden in Italy for day 2 of the 50th G7 summit. The China threat and Beijing's support for Russia's war on Ukraine, top issues for leaders at that annual meeting. Here's President Biden yesterday. Watch.
At the G7, we discussed our shared concern about countries like China, who are supplying Russia with materials they need for their war machine. And we agreed to taking collective action to push back against that activity.
Yeah, let's see what collective action comes up. Ukrainian President Zelensky also said yesterday that Chinese President Xi Jinping told him and gave him his word that Beijing would not sell weapons to Russia. And they are, we're told. Meanwhile, Biden appears to wander off during a skydiving demonstration. Watch this. You can see Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni pulling him back toward the group once she notices that he just strayed. Not sure where he's going. Let's see. Let's watch this here. She goes to get him now and brings him back. Joining me now is Hudson Institute Senior Fellow, Atlas Organization founder, and the author of The Decisive Decade, Jonathan D.T. Ward, back with us. Jonathan, great to see you. Thanks very much for being here. And, you know, it doesn't please anybody to show these pictures of the commander-in-chief of the free world in some of these gaffes, or wandering away, not knowing where he's going, or shaking people's hands who are not there, or sitting down where there's not a chair behind him. But unfortunately, it's not just us watching, Jonathan. China is watching. President Biden is now said to become a national security threat for the United States, and it's being watched on the world stage. What is your reaction?
Yeah, look, I guess I would have a different take on this. I think the G7 summit is starting to get into the right issues. I mean, you do need European-American unity on this. I mean, together, we're the largest markets in the world. I mean, China's essentially neck and neck with Europe, depending on the measurements, if you include Britain, which obviously isn't in the Union anymore. But all things together, U.S., Europe, Japan, I mean, that's half the world economy. And for us to start finally talking about China's role in Putin's invasion in Ukraine, which, as you know, and as your viewers know, I mean, I've explained that to people from the very beginning. But here we are finally doing that as a very big chunk of the global economy. So I think the ability to take the sanctions that are on Russia that, you know, may look like they haven't had enough of an effect in the short term, but in the long run, those are going to start to disconnect Russia from global capital markets, from a whole lot of the world economy. I mean, it's going to set in over time and really constrict them. And we have to pull China into that, into containment. I mean, we have one shot at containment. And if we're going to do it as an alliance system, if we start to get the Europeans into this, and I'm happy to see that that's starting to happen, then I think we're going to win in the long run. And we're going to contain those two characters that you see on the screen. I mean, they will not win the century if we can act with our partners and allies. So, you know, I think there are a lot of important things happening, but more needs to happen.
What do you want to see in terms of acting? Because, Jonathan, we hear a lot of talk, right? And we're hearing more talk. So here we are hearing them talk about it. I agree. It's nice to see them talk about it. But what do you actually want to see in terms of action from these leaders? I mean, Giorgia Meloni has actually taken a stand. She said, we are not going to continue this Belt and Road strategy that China has implemented in Italy, thanks to my predecessor. She put a line out there. She drew her red line. So I get you. You're right. Italy, I see what they're doing in Italy and Giorgia Meloni. But what else is being done?
Sure, that's great, but there's still 140 countries involved in the Belt and Road. And, you know, I think what needs to happen is we have to go after the Chinese corporations. The best way to do that, the smartest way to do that, is to think big on this and execute on some of the big ones. I mean, right now, I think where things are too weak is the conversation around sanctioning Chinese banks is about the smaller banks. And as some people point out, you know, some of these little banks are the ones that China's going to use to get around Western sanctions into Russia. So if they move their transactions into smaller banks that can be sanctioned, you know, that allows them a sort of the ability to let a bank fall and not be affected. But some of the biggest banks in China, I mean, the big four Chinese state-owned commercial banks, two of them are incredibly active in Russia. So Agricultural Bank of China, which is the #4 bank in China, and then China Construction Bank, which is the #2 bank in China. I think those are the two targets. That's what I would be most interested in. Those ones, as very good researchers have pointed out, are digging in Russia. I mean, that's been true from the beginning. You know, so I think we go after some of the big four state-owned state-owned banks that are essentially tied to Putin's military enterprise, and then the whole rest of the State-Owned Assets and Supervision Commission. I mean, you have 97 corporations, $5 trillion in revenue, 30 trillion in assets. All of that is the bulk of the Chinese state. It does their global business worldwide. It's China incorporated, and that's the strike zone. I think that's where we have to be targeting. So no, we're not thinking big. We're not acting big on that stuff. But there's a huge, beautiful target set that I think we should be very busy on and get our allies in. I mean, if it takes these sorts of meetings to get people to understand the problem, the next move has to be action.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And, you know, by the way, the major banks who want to operate in China should be reminded that the largest banks in the world are Chinese. So the competition is serious, and they are looking to take out American banks and continue financing the world by communist China. The Wall Street Journal reporting that a new Chinese megaport in Peru is rattling the United States officials. They write this: the U.S. worries that China's control over what could become South America's first true global commercial hub. This will allow Beijing to further strengthen its grip over the region's resources, deepen its influence among America's closest neighbors, and eventually plant its military nearby. And, Jonathan, we know that that's been the CCP's MO. You know, go into a region, make loans, make it so hard to loan all this money to that country. They're unable to pay it back because they don't have the money, and then ultimately say, well, then we'll just take over this port. And yes, then we'll build our military right near it. And this is the worry increasingly.
This is a really great example. I mean, the Chancay port in Peru, I mean, this is exactly what I described in China's vision of victory in a way that no one had before. I mean, they're building an empire of trade, and this is what it looks like to really lose. I mean, they have 100 ports worldwide that they control. I mean, from Africa to Europe to South America, and this one, it's a $3.5 billion megaport. And again, it just, you know, it's Costco. The China Ocean Shipping Corporation, backed by Bank of China and a consortium of Chinese banks, so they're able to go and do these sorts of projects. They own it. They have the controlling interest, 60%. 40% is a Peruvian company that's mixed with Glencore. But, you know, you even had Peru had to essentially take legislative action to permit foreign companies to own critical infrastructure in order to let this deal ultimately go through. So what they're going to do is they're going to, you know, mainline copper out of Peru, soybeans out of Brazil, tie the region closer to China. And this is the Belt and Road in its sort of consummate form. I mean, this is really the essence of Chinese grand strategy. You can see two fundamental things happening. On one hand, you have Putin's war in Europe that's you know, created a majorly conflict in a major theater of the world. And on the other hand, they're buying up ports and building infrastructure worldwide in order to create an empire of trade and ultimately encircle us through that, to beat us in trade, to convert that into financial power, to let their corporates essentially run wild without any real pushback. And that's how they ultimately win. And in the meantime, we're still financing it. We're still transferring technology. We're still giving them access to our markets. And you can stop all three of those things and turn this around. And that's where I want to see real political will to start to take down the Chinese empire. I mean, that's what we have to do. We cannot let them build this into global markets. Well, because the country has not made up its mind on whether or not we have a serious problem. We need to make up our minds on that and get busy on striking these companies and banks that actually build the economic foundations.
You know, it's partly the Treasury who won't attack these Chinese companies that you're referring to. Many of those Chinese companies trade on our exchanges, and they're still trading on our exchanges, even if they're sanctioned. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is now warning that China's, quote, over-concentrated supply chains pose a threat to U.S. jobs and the U.S. green energy sector. She spoke at the Economic Club of New York yesterday, saying that Beijing's trade policies may interfere significantly with efforts to build a healthy economic relationship. Jonathan, we've been talking about these supply chains for a long time. And why we still have been unable to cut the supply chains and get the supplies that we need elsewhere is beyond me. How long? I know it doesn't happen overnight, but how long is it going to take to actually lessen the dependence on China? And right now, we're talking about a climate change agenda out of the Biden administration that once again relies on China to build the batteries and all of the other things needed for electric vehicles and the climate change agenda.
Well, sure. And according to JP Morgan, China now controls 77% of the global battery manufacturing. So in total. So again, yes, I mean, they are playing for monopoly. I mean, that's what China's really about. I'm glad to see the Secretary of the Treasury is starting to understand how Chinese strategy really works, but we don't have much time on this. I mean, you look at something like Made in China 2025 with the 10 sectors that they talk about. I mean, the goal here is indigenization at home and then ultimately control of those supply chains and the underlying industries at home. I mean, again, you tie it to the port in South America. It's to bring lithium in. I mean, they're trying to control the entire supply chain and value chain and sell it back onto Western markets. So we have to understand that. We have to take out the companies, take out the banks involved, do that to the maximum extent, and then make this a boardroom decision. I mean, yes, tariffs on the Made in China 2025 industries so that boardrooms have to, so that it becomes a business problem to fix the supply chain. I mean, it's going to be fixed by businesses.
All right, we will leave it there. We'll keep watching your work. As always, Jonathan, great to talk with you. Jonathan D.T. Ward on Communist China.